disruption, we have to embrace work and life balance, change the habit, not only working from home, but working from anywhere. Each of us already facing this triple disruption, but what matter are how we can structure our response into this situation. Different cultures have a different response. Different countries have a different response. Different cultures have also different approach. And I have talked to Mr. Bimo and Dr. Stuart Kelly that for this type of world-class sharing, you need a distinguished professor on this topic that are very relevant to audience. And for today's topic, effective leadership in uncertain time, the right person of the topic. I know his book in HR management become management textbook and translated into various languages, including Bahasa Indonesia. The name is Buku Manajemen Sumber Daya Manusia. So Professor Chris Rowley. I'm looking forward to hear Professor Chris Rowley lecture on effective leadership in the era of uncertainty. I will look if Dr. Stuart Kelly is here. I will pass the microphone to you, Professor Stuart. Sorry, Dr. Stuart Kelly, as soon as I see you in my screen. Yes, here you are, Dr. Stuart Kelly. I pass the microphone to you. Please continue our webinar session. I will be here as an active participant during the question and answer. When there are a question in Bahasa, I'm more than happy to act as translator. Dr. Stuart Kelly, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bintoro. That's amazing. Thank you. And it's a real pleasure, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity. We're very much delighted to have this opportunity to speak, to work with Euro Management on this seminar, and also to reach out to the wonderful people that are coming in from Indonesia as well. So it's a great opportunity, and thank you, Mr. Bimo, for the opportunity to work with you. A little bit about my background. I'm a graduate of the University of Cambridge. That's where I did my MPhil, my PhD. And then I went to work for the University of Oxford, and I was a director of studies at the same college that Chris is actually at right now. So it's Kellogg College. It's one of the newer colleges in the university system. It's my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker this morning, Professor Chris Rowley. So Chris is a graduate of the University of Warwick, where he did his BA and MA, and then he did his DPhil at the University of Oxford. He has published extensively in more than 700 journals, books, and chapters in books. So he's a prolific author, a contributor to many newspapers, including the Financial Times, South China Morning Post, etc. And he is going to speak with us, for us today, on a very important topic. I think we've all been touched by this global pandemic, and we need to look for effective leadership, both at the government level and also at the board level of corporations. So it's my great pleasure to pass the mic over to Professor Chris Rowley, who's coming in from Oxford this morning, who will be talking to us on the need for effective leadership in uncertain times. Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you for such a gracious and warm introduction. And I make the time about 7 minutes past 9, but I'll still try and keep to the approximate hour and the approximate time for Q&A at the end, because I'm sure there'll be some questions. Can you all see my slides? Yep.
Yes.
Good. That's the main thing. Otherwise, I failed the first technological test. So, in terms of what I would like to get through today in the next hour, it would be those things really. It's something about where we're going to go with an introduction, something why I think is important, something about what uncertainty means in terms of its terminology, its acceptability by different people, and then a couple of examples with cases with a typo there, my apologies, of a person I think is an effective leader and a person who I think isn't an effective leader. So you can have a spectrum of examples. And then the final part really is, what is it in terms of ingredients effective leaders should have, and then a quick conclusion, and then a Q&A session. So that's what we need to get through. And I always put this slide up for people. And despite the scaffolding on Big Ben, which I think should be removed or has been removed, most people would have a guess at who that might be. Certainly if you're British, American, Canadian, Australian, most Europeans would know, even from the silhouette at the back, the walking stick, the stance is the giveaway. Because it gave rise to a proverb, really, which is, cometh the hour, cometh the man. And so I suppose really it's the idea that the right leaders will come to the fore during uncertainty and crisis. So I guess there's the man for you. It's Winston himself, still voted the greatest Briton ever, far more than John Lennon and Lady Di and whoever else you can think of. It's always Winston, because cometh the hour, cometh the man. So he's indelibly linked to his leadership. Disastrous leader before the war, a disastrous leader after the war. However, cometh the hour, cometh the man, a great leader during the war. And that's because of the conditions. So the hour, I think, has come in terms of the market business turmoil with the COVID-19 pandemic. And the way to think about it is to think of a famous American investment banker. Well, I don't normally like to quote American investment bankers. A man called Warren Buffett, who says, you know, when the tide goes out, it's easy to see who's swimming naked. And so what he means by that is when the tide of history moves, it's easy to manage an easy tide. But when that tide goes out, you'll soon see who's got some swimming costumes on, who hasn't got anything. And I think COVID has shown us that. It's shown us those leaders that weren't swimming naked. And unfortunately, a lot of leaders that weren't, because they haven't got a clue what to do. So that's the introduction, really. Why I think it's an important topic is really because I make a couple of simple assumptions. It matters. Otherwise, why are we here today? If we didn't think it mattered, and the research doesn't show that, we wouldn't be here on a Saturday morning. 30 years of research shows that it makes a difference. And how does it make a difference? It makes a difference because it impacts on businesses or organizations. Yeah. Whether that's, you know, the Apple of this world, the Google of this world, or the NHS of this world, or the army, they're all organizations, but leadership matters. And organizations are not just obviously businesses, but public sector organizations, hospital systems. It impacts on us as employees. It impacts on customers and societies. So I think it matters in those four areas. And of course, I think the real reason it matters is because whether we like it or not, some of us will lead people and we will be followers. Unless you're a sort of hermit monk up in a cave somewhere, most people, whether they like it or not, and I don't particularly like it because I'm an academic and most academics don't like to be led. They think they can do themselves. You end up being led, or you end up leading. And, you know, as the person says, no one said it was easy to be a follower because, you know, they're all pointing in different directions. Where do I go? I think that's the second reason it's important. So that's the first two parts, really. The third part is really about what do we mean by uncertain times? Well, we've got this image in our head that we know what that means. But there could be a succession of other words, couldn't there? It could be turbulent times. Famous management guru Peter Drucker said, the greatest danger in times of turbulence isn't the turbulence itself, it's not the danger. The danger is acting with yesterday's logic. And so you can see that coming to play in terms of COVID. You know, COVID, okay, is dangerous, it caused turbulence, but acting at the beginning of the pandemic, it was all about washing your hands, which clearly was yesterday's logic, because of course this is an aerosol transmitted virus. It requires a different logic, which is face masks, distance, open space, all the things that have come to light since. So acting with yesterday's logic. I suppose, you know, the famous sort of books written on it are Ethel Orange, Leading in Turbulent Times, or Doris Goodwin, Leaders in Turbulent Times. That's quite a sort of common word to use. Volatile. ambiguous, complex. You could use any of those words. And I suspect the most famous book you'll come across is Bob Johansson's one, because he says leaders make the future, and he uses the word uncertain world rather than certain times, and the skills that leaders need. And he has a lovely little framework that's very useful to remember, and he puts an acronym, VUCA, V-U-C-A. It's about volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And what he argues is, basically, what happens is leaders listen to the future as hard work. How do you cut through all that noise of the VUCA world, the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity? How do you cut through all of that? Because he causes a framework, doesn't it, of, how can you project the outcome of your actions, low or small? How much do you know about the situation, low and small? So you can sort of put those words on a sort of management framework, whereby the higher it is, the lower it is. Now, I'm always, as you'll discover during this talk, a great believer of simple frameworks because they provide you a takeaway. And when you think about what have I taken away from this talk, hopefully you'll take away a couple of frameworks, one of which would be this one, about a negative or a low versus a positive or a high variable on both frameworks. Because what it's trying to teach you to think about is uncertainty varies, isn't it? Complexity, ambiguity, they all vary because it could be small or large. So it's a scale variability. So that's one issue. So there's your scale. Is the uncertainty small or is it large? I think the key one that's caught a lot of people with COVID would be, what's the velocity of the change or uncertainty, complexity? And that can be low. Nothing really happens on a day-to-day basis, or a big high. And the COVID crisis has had lots of velocity and speed, hasn't it? How fast are you traveling? How fast you're traveling in a certain direction? And you can see that with the waves that are ongoing of infections around the world. I was just looking at the BBC News this morning, and that is quite an interesting article on comparing the whole world in terms of cases and deaths. And they put it down by region: the Middle East, South America, Africa, and Europe. And in Europe, it's about what people might think. The UK has the highest levels of cases, by far exceeding Spain, Italy, Portugal, because the velocity and speed of infections increased. It's now hitting about 35 to 40,000 cases a day. That's quite a lot of velocity. That's not like Japan, where they have 2 cases and it's a national emergency. And of course, the key, and this is where it comes into play, is that it's the unclear pattern. It's the fluctuation, give it the word, isn't it? And I just gave you a graph there of gross domestic product, and that would fit the COVID crisis quite nicely. Off it starts, up goes to a peak, cases decline, but of course that wasn't the end, was it? That was just the first peak, and then off it goes again, or waves as they tend to call it in COVID terms, and it's gone down the other side. In the UK, it's gone down the other side and slowly creeping up again to a third wave. Whether it reaches that peak level, probably won't, but what it does have, it has scale, it has velocity, and it has a killer, fluctuations. You don't know the direction because it's suddenly changed. So what it means, of course, is that if you talk about uncertain, leaders are trying to work out how uncertain things are, we'd all like the following, really, wouldn't we? We'd all like to be there. This is where the people could swim naked in the sea. Your decisions made under certainty. You know the consequences of every alternative and decision choice. That's quite a nice place to be. Of course, the opposite of that is a very unpleasant place to be, which is uncertainty. You don't know the probabilities of the outcomes. But of course, there is an intermediary, which is this one. You end up with a type 3 where you sort of don't know everything, but you do know some things. So therefore, this is the sort of gambler. If you're playing cards, hopefully a professional poker player isn't operating under certainty or uncertainty. The professional gambler is operating under risk, isn't he? He sort of knows the probabilities. When I play cards, I don't. I'm not that clever. I go with a gut feeling. I'm not a professional counter of the numbers. Professional gamblers will know the probability of the next card being X. And that's the same with decision making. You know the probabilities of various outcomes. It's a bit like the car industry at the moment. Everybody's rushing towards electric vehicles. So you sort of know, the direction of travel, you know the velocity. People are not totally certain what type of battery at the moment, are they? But you're making it. So, for example, the Chinese are all betting on a blade type battery made from lithium ions. At the moment, nobody else is. Now, it's an interesting risk decision. If you're Volkswagen or Jaguar Land Rover, which battery technology do you go for? Do you go for the traditional ones that are being used by Tesla and Nissan and all the existing players, which is based on a quite expensive raw materials that are difficult to get hold of because something like 60% of cobalt is from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is pretty hard to get hold of, versus the Chinese version, which is just using lithium ion, which is pretty easy to get hold of. It's cheaper, but it's a different technology. So if I was sitting in Volkswagen's head office in Wolfsburg, I'd be thinking, do we buy into that? I would. The Chinese at the moment are all selling these cars to Norway with these new battery systems. So they'll have economies of scale for certain. So I think that's where you make a decision under risk. You know some probability here. Traditionally, Chinese car manufacturers have not been that great because they're competing with traditional diesel petrol engines from Daimler. You're never going to beat Volkswagen and Daimler. However, for batteries, it's a different ballgame. I think following the car industry electronic evolutions is fascinating at the moment for that reason. Which way will the big players go, the Fords of this world? If you're a senior manager in Ford, what will you be thinking in terms of uncertainty about the future? And so what you end up with, of course, is this sort of simple framework. If you're a manager, do you make your decision on uncertainty? Yes, please. That's nice. I don't like the uncertainty side of it either. However, the risk of ambiguity in making a bad decision is, in the middle is a risk, and that's what leadership is about. And it'd be lovely if you didn't have any uncertainty in life, but you do. So I think a framework to think about is where are we in the middle? How risky is this decision, to use the car industry example, to follow the the Chinese, which will come with its own political consequences and geopolitical consequences, obviously. But at one time I always thought it was going to be Tesla that would lead the world. First mover, slightly erratic, strange chief executive. But now, over the last few months, I've been moving towards, unfortunately, the Chinese leading the world with electronic cars anyway. But anyway, that's enough about them. More about what sort of uncertainty do managers need to have? And again, I don't normally quote former secretaries of defense from America, who passed away earlier this year, actually, who made a famous speech in 2002 using an old concept from the 50s. But what I like about Mr. Rumsfeld is he tells us those three things, doesn't he? He tells us there are no knowns. This is what we like in life. We know those. That's lovely. If only life was full of those. And of course, there are those things. There are known unknowns. Things we know we don't know. So don't worry about them. The scary one, this is the one he was making the speech about, of course, are these things we don't know we don't know. And now these things come out of the blue. We don't even know. And so how do you manage that? How do you manage the unknown unknowns? So there's the three things that we know, are aware of, and understand. Things we know, we don't know. We're aware of the moon, don't understand how it's made, or how it works. What about the unknown? Is there a planet out there we don't know about? Don't know about that. We're neither aware of it nor understand. But if that drops on your door, or on your plate, or on your table, how do you lead there? That's sort of pushing the uncertainty definition forward. So that's sort of like the one side of the periscope, because there is another side to the periscope, of course. Because you're looking down as a leader thinking, okay, I've sort of got a grasp of the environment, how uncertain it is, how much do I know? Of course, there is another side to that, isn't there? And that's because there's a total variation in comfortableness, as I use there, or acceptance of uncertainty. Some people thrive on uncertainty. Every day is a new day, every day is different, every day is a challenge. But of course, there is the opposite of that. People who do not like uncertainty, do not like ambiguity, very uncomfortable. And for all the people at this talk who've ever traveled to Japan and dealt with Japanese businesses or even Japanese academics, they're on one end of the spectrum of being uncomfortable with uncertainty. Do not try and change anything that's been agreed. Don't try to cancel anything that's been agreed. Do not suddenly slip in questions that you've not agreed beforehand and got the answer for. And you can see that coming into play in the 80s and 90s when people did research on Japanese companies in Britain. They could never work out how come it always seemed to be consensus. Because all the decisions have been made behind the scene. And what they don't want is uncertainty on the day. They know the answer. I suppose the way to look at that would be why. And for all the problems that my old friend Gert, who also passed away last year, has picked up, I think culture has a lot of traction, has a lot of validity still. He has a great quote there, before computers existed. He called culture as the collective programming of the mind. It distinguishes the members of one group from another. So it's those sort of assumptions we have about X. Why do we do Y? It's the collective programming of the mind. And that can apply to national cultures, countries, which is what Gert was interested in. He's an anthropologist. It also applies to businesses. People often say, there is an Apple way or a Google culture or a deep mind culture, to use the part of the Google empire that's investigating artificial intelligence. They'll say it's the way we do things here. There's a HP way, Hewlett Packard way. I think Gert was useful because, again, it gave us a framework of 6 dimensions. And there they are. So you can sort of chop cultures up with those 6 dimensions. And I'm not going to spend any time on 5 of them, whether it's power distance, collectivism, femininity, how long-term, short-term you are, how indulgent or not you are, because, of course, he actually hits the nail on the head, doesn't he? He knows about uncertainty. So one of his dimensions is, are you on a low uncertainty avoidance scale or high uncertainty scale? And of course, it's a spectrum. He's not saying you either are one or the other, but you'd be somewhere on there. You could be 0, 10, 20, 30, whatever scale you wish to have, moving towards the opposite end of that spectrum. And the reason he does that, of course, is because he argues that societies vary by high scores. It's the tolerance for uncertainty. Very rule-oriented society defines laws. Intolerant of unorthodox behaviour. And the opposite of that, of course, if you have a low score, would be less rule-orientated, accept change, willing to take risks, something you're different. In your mind now, I think you could start to sort of put countries on this scale, because that's what Gert does. we'll avoid that one. He starts to say, well, are you comfortable with uncertainty? Or does it create anxiety? So he spent some time researching countries around the world on all these 6 dimensions, but we'll only focus on the uncertainty one. He came out with what I thought was a really interesting chart he did for a journal article I asked him to write. And you can see clearly that just because you score high on one scale doesn't mean you score high on all scales. That's the first thing. So you could be high on power index, low on uncertainty, like China. So if we just focus on our friend uncertainty here, you see clearly slotted in countries that are on the high scale. There's Japan for you, pretty obvious. France, probably, yeah, that's right. You know, anybody's dealt with French businesses in terms of the hierarchy and certainty. Of course, on the other end, we have countries like China. I mean, like Stuart, I've dealt with Chinese businesses and people long enough to know nothing is agreed until everything's agreed, and anything can change at any minute. And it's just about flexibility. Nothing to do with uncertainty. That's how business is done, you know. But I know it's 2 o'clock and we've agreed to meet at 2. How about 3? Okay, 3's fine. How about tomorrow? Tomorrow's fine. Oh, we've changed our mind. Well, that's fine. So you can see clearly that to most British and most Americans isn't a deal breaker. It's not rudeness. How dare you? If you do that to a Japanese business person, then you're in a whole world of pain, because they do think that. They do think it's rude. They do think it's not acceptable. This has been agreed. Well, we will do it. So I think it's fascinating the way that people respond to uncertainty. I'm a bit like Stuart, as I said, you know, quite happy to go along with ambiguity, because that's the way we think things work. But clearly not everybody does. So the reason that's important is because, of course, you end up with issues of uncertainty varies across countries, doesn't it? So it has implications for you as a leader or a manager, because if you operate in a cross-cultural setting, how are you now going to operate? I've just stuck a few in there, so some Chinese people, some Brits. We're okay, we don't mind ambiguity. Unfortunately, I've stuck in the Japanese and the German there, and they're not very happy about this. The Americans okay. The French, no, we're not very keen about this. How do you manage an international business or an international team? They've all brought their assumptions to this uncertainty. And that's a classic thing to bear in mind. Fine if you've got a bit like the Koreans in the 1960s, when the Korean businesses were expanding in the 1960s in Korea, totally ethnic, homogeneous population, workforce, no really problems. They all had the same assumptions. Once Hyundai and Samsung started to expand overseas into Malaysia, for example, they had real problems because they got that table with those people sitting around it, but they weren't all Korean. There's some Koreans in there, there's some Malaysians in there, there's some ethnic Malays, Chinese Malays, and all hell broke loose in the Samsung factories in Kuala Lumpur when I was there, because it's like the expression is a dialogue of the deaf. They didn't really communicate. So hopefully you've gone away with a takeaway there, which is about, before we move on to the next section, for the next half an hour, about what uncertainty is, why it's important that you recognize it varies around the world in terms of people being comfortable and reacting to it, and how they're going to respond to the same event. So what I thought I would then link into it would be leadership in terms of different views. And of course, it's a classic one. Is it the same or management? I think it's different. Warren Bennis, great consultant, said the manager accepts status quo, the leader challenges it. You can spend an hour on definitions if you want. I'm not going to. I'm just going to give you 2 or 3. Leadership's the capacity to translate vision into reality. And I always often put down the example of Steve Jobs. If you were forced to put Steve Jobs into a category, pretty obvious which category you put him into. He didn't accept the status quo. He had lots of foibles and irritating habits, but he certainly didn't accept the status quo. And he certainly had a vision. His classic vision was, can I have music in a box that I can carry around with me? That was the iPod. Go away and make it. I'm not a marketeer, I'm not an engineer, I'm an ideas man. So he showed leadership, didn't he? Because I think Rosenweg had the best sort of definition about leadership. It's to gather appropriate information, evaluate that information, make choices. And of course, his real sort of sting in his definition is the last bit of the quote. While recognizing the fundamental nature of uncertainty. This is back to the Warren Buffett one of when the tide goes out, who's swimming naked? You recognize the fundamental nature of business uncertainty. It'd be lovely if it wasn't. It'd be lovely if the car industry was always going to have big diesel engines, big petrol engines made by Daimler and Volkswagen. That's not happening, is it? Because the fundamental nature of business uncertainty. You can see it coming with energy, exactly the same with energy companies, particularly gas companies. It's about that uncertainty. So I thought I'd give you a couple of examples of what I think is effective leadership in uncertain times, in terms of what is and what might not be, because I think this is the best definition of it as an effective leader. Written by, well, he was an academic, but he was a novelist, really. Again, unfortunately, everybody I quote is dead, including this unfortunate person who died quite young, David Foster Wallace. And as I said, he's not an academic, he never wrote about leadership. He wrote some strange books. This one, Consider the Lobster, very odd title. But in there, if you read it, he says, real leaders are those who help us overcome the limitations of our own laziness and selfishness and weakness and fear. Because they're going to get us to do better, harder things than we can do on our own. And in a social science sort of meaning, it means that's a counterfactual, because what you don't know is these things could have happened anyway. If these things happened anyway, then leadership wouldn't make a difference. So this one is trying to tease out counterfactual, how to remove, well, this would have happened anyway without any great leader input. So that's why I like him. And I suppose really, I spent a while looking around for a person who did that, who overcomes the limitations of our laziness, selfishness and weakness and fear. He has to do better, harder things than we would do on our own. And again, there's the man I came up with, and 100% certainty, nobody except Stuart knows who that is. Certainly dead, as ever, with me. From 1913, that photograph. Most British people would know the name, might not know the photograph, but they would know the name. And that's who it is, Ernest Shackleton. And the picture just sort of showing you the story here of what effective leadership can be in uncertain times. He sets off, whatever reason, he wants to go and walk across the Antarctic. Everybody's different. So off he goes just before the First World War in his wooden boat. And you're thinking, this is not a good idea. And he passes several trawlers apparently coming the other way, saying, there is pack ice ahead. And he thinks, oh no, we know better than that. Off he goes. Anyway, the pack ice wins, as you can see, gets trapped, wooden boat, ice. One conclusion, it's going to sink. And of course, he hasn't got GPS, he hasn't got mobile phones. In fact, people don't know he's trapped, so why would they send any rescue? They don't know he's trapped, do they? So there he is, he's stuck on the ice. First World War has started as well, so the world's got better things to think about than poor old Ernest and his 26 crew stuck on ice, thousands of miles from anywhere. It's not looking good, is it? How are you going to get home from there? Of course, what some people say is everybody died. Clearly not, otherwise we would be talking about it. So you know they're not all going to die. Off he goes. August 1914, sets sail on the Endurance, gets trapped and gets sunk in November 15. He's already living on the ice, and he knows he's got to do something. He knows he's got to do something. So he sets off in April 1916, that's 2 years later, don't forget. He's been down there for 2 years on 3 small boats. He lands on a nearby island. I'll show you this in a chart in a minute. And then sets off with 5 more crew members on a small boat. Spends 16 days across sea to go to another island. She walks across that island to a whaling station. You know, there's pictures of the books written about it. Give it away. Ice trap. And there he is dragging his boat across with his 5 crew members. And lo and behold, he rescues the crew in 1916. And there they are. He gets to take home, and safe and sound, every crew member. Doesn't lose one, which I find phenomenal, really. He gets all 28 home. So he's actually done something quite impressive there in terms of leadership. He's gone from a disaster, i.e. ignoring all the clues that he shouldn't be doing this, ignoring advice from other ships. His mission's blown up in smoke, which was to walk across the Antarctic without killing everyone. He's lost his ship, he's lost all his money. Nobody cares about him because the war started. So his original strategy is gone, but he gets everybody home. And there you go. That's what he does in terms of his big picture. He sets off, gets trapped, goes across pack ice. That's a phenomenal story because he's done things. To think of that quotation I gave you about what effective leaders are. He's got that crew of 26 very, 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 very different characters home, hasn't he? He's got them all home. And that because it gives you lessons. Again, as a takeaway, I think there are a few lessons. He assumed responsibility for his team. Famous books written on it, as you can see, Leading at the Edge, Shackleton's expedition. First thought was for the crew's welfare. He displayed belief, not weaknesses or fears. And he did that every day. And every night, if you get a bored moment, read his diaries. He wrote diaries. And in the diaries at night time, he wrote all his weaknesses and fears. I'm going to die. We're not going to make it. I'm going mad. Shouldn't have done this. I'm a fool. That all went in the diary. And the next day, got up. We're going home. I'm going to get you home. Focused on the future. There you go. Why are they playing football on the ice, you might say, on that book? Because that's his model, isn't it? Maintain morale, routines. His own example. He was an ex-Navy officer. So every morning he got up, attempted to have a shave, got dressed in his uniform and tried to maintain morale, routines and examples. And the key thing he did, I think, is this one. Out of those 26 crew members, as you can probably guess, not everybody's going to be as upbeat as everybody else. And so the most skeptical crew members, all those who said, oh no, we're going to die, it's all over, you're a lunatic, he put them all in his own tent. That must have been a really happy place to be. But he got them all with him every night. So he was listening to all their defeatist claims and worries and fears. And the reason he did that, of course, is because our friend Sun Tzu would tell us that. You keep your friends close, that's fine. But you keep your enemies ever closer, don't you? What you don't want them is in the other tents telling the rest of your crew, you're a disaster, we're going to die, we're never going to make it. You don't want him saying that. Take to me. So that's what he did. Every night he put them in his tent, he listened to them. So I think sort of principles he had was that optimism, communication, flexibility, strong example, encourage and enjoyment. The football. I think he's a fascinating example. People say about history teaching you lessons. I think Shackleton will always teach us lessons, despite his age. I'm still looking for people who provide a better example of that. And that's because, of course, in terms of a case, they say Goffey and Jones probably hit it on the nail. 2 famous academics from LBS. Unfortunately, Rob Goffey's still alive, but Gareth Jones passed away earlier this year. And he said, leaders don't become great by aspiring to a list of traits. That's not what they do. They're authentic in 2 ways. They deploy those strengths to engage followers' hearts, minds, and souls. Think of Shackleton. Think of how he did that. He engaged followers is just a term that academics use for, it's not religious meaning. It means the people you lead, their followers, so they get called followers. That could be staff, co-workers, team workers, whichever word you want. How do you engage their heart, mind, and soul? And it's skillful about being themselves, because you need to alter the behaviour and respond to the changing context. That's the uncertainty, isn't it? You can't do the same things at all times. So they wrote a famous book, really, about why should anyone be led by you? I think that's worth reading by everybody, really. They did a follow-up called, Why Should I Work Here? It's the same sort of thing from Goff and James, but the why should anyone be led by you is far more important, I think. I then gave a sort of counter case, and this is a far more current one. This is from early this year in February, and this is somebody who's the opposite of Shackleton. He was the chief executive of KPMG in the UK, Bill Michael. And this is from Financial Times, really, because what he did was he quit in February 2021. Why? Because he did a famous broadcast Zoom meeting with his staff, and he told them to stop moaning about working conditions during a discussion about the pandemic's impact on people's lives. Stop playing the victim's card. That probably wasn't a clever thing to say. It wouldn't have been a clever thing to say in a private meeting. It certainly wasn't a clever thing to say in a public broadcasting of staff. Of course, it was leaked straight away. You can see the interview on the BBC. And of course, what he did display was no authenticity. He was not showing any humanity or vulnerability, no ability to make sense of the situation he was in, no empathy or kindness, no adaptability. He lacked any of those skills by stressing the staff, stop playing the victim card. I mean, he did apologise later, but this is a classic sort of chief executive cop-out, isn't it? His words did not reflect his beliefs. Now, what does that mean? That's called putting your foot in your mouth, I think. I shouldn't have said that. So he did recognise in much choice, because he had to resign from it. There's so much PR fallout, he had to go. And the reason he did that is because he didn't have any of what we would call today. And again, think of Shackleton. We didn't have the word back in 1913. The word emotional intelligence didn't exist. It does today. And to me, that's exactly what Shackleton had. He had the ability to understand and manage himself, his own emotions, but critically, those people around you. You don't lead in a vacuum. You don't lead in a black box. You lead with interacting with other people. So those with a high degree of emotional intelligence know what they're feeling, what they mean, and critically, of course, how that affects others. I'm afraid old Mr. Michael didn't quite grasp that bit of it. He may have felt all those things. I'm sure he felt frustrated, all the rest of the things he felt, but he did not understand, by saying that, people who was leading did not feel the same. So, sort of final sort of part of this one about effective leaders is what makes them. I won't spend a lot of time on this other than just give you the sort of classic two views, and that's the sort of classic two views, really. Historically, most people thought true leaders are born, not made. That's the great person theory. So if you look at the literature for the first 100 years of academic research on leadership, they're all looking for these magic ingredients. Were leaders tall, short, aggressive, passive? The great person theory. But there's a whole section of people after that said leaders aren't born, actually made. It doesn't really matter who you are, they're definable, learnable skills. And that's the sort of school I've come down onto, really. And sort of the way to look at it is a sort of vaguely humorous one. And I always put these four characters. Great leaders: Julius Caesar, Napoleon, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates. And I often say, what do they have in common? Well, one's French, one's Italian, Sicilian, two are American, two have got glasses, one What else could they have in common? Of course, don't expect anybody to know this, but the clue is that. The clue is Mr. Gates' hand. They're all left-handed. Steve Jobs was left-handed, Napoleon's left-handed, hence his hand. Julius Caesar was left-handed. Perhaps that's a great leader. I'm left-handed, actually. My mum and dad are left-handed. So you know the same answer now. This is just a more humorous one for you. You know the answer to this one. What do all those presidents have in common? Everybody from Garfield, Hoover, Truman, Ford, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Obama. There's the clue. They're all left-handed. 78% of presidents have been left-handed, but only 1 in 11 are born left-handed. That's a fascinating, I don't know why. It's just a fascinating correlation, I think. I don't think it's a causation. I think it's just a correlation. I hope it's a correlation. To be fair, Ronald Reagan was ambidextrous, man. He could write with both hands. But as you can see, most presidents you will never see photographed writing, except for Obama. He didn't mind being photographed signing left-handed. Reagan never did. He used to have a pen in front of him, but you would never see him in his hand. Same with Bush. So don't see photographs in their hand. Of course, being left-handed is a sign of the devil. As I was told when I was at school, as they tried to make me right-handed. Obama didn't care, as you can see. He was quite happy to be seen with it in his hand. But the other one's far more difficult to get photos of. But of course, the big key one would be, if it is a trait, which leader, what trait, physical, mental, personality, are all the traits important? How much do you need? A little bit left-handed. Of course, a killer one would always be, not all leaders have those traits. And of course, non-leaders have them all, like me. I'm left-handed, but I'm not a great leader. So I suppose really, the side I come down on really is Warren Bennis, which he would argue it's a leadership myth, that there's some sort of genetic factor, whether that's biological, physical, mental. He argues the opposite is true. Leaders are made, not born. But I think, again, as a takeaway, for every book that comes out saying, these are the 10 characteristics of successful CEOs, I'd be very skeptical. It's no different than these famous books written. These are the 10 characteristics of a successful company. The next book is normally where they failed. Same companies have failed. And so you end up with sort of arguments that say, well, if it's not inherited, what is it based on? And I just use 2 dimensions. I won't spend too much time on these because I'm a bit short of time now. It's about the concern for decisions in terms of involvement versus people and work. And the famous leadership research on that is worth just reiterating quickly. Carl Lewin, and he can easily put leaders on this scale, no trouble whatsoever. Mr. Putin appears straight away there. Autocratic leadership style, focused on command by the leader, highly structured, very rigid. Of course, there is an intermediary one, a laissez-faire, non-interference one, where they say, well, actually leadership is delegated. And again, it's a spectrum. It's not saying you're one or the other. It's how much from autocratic laissez-faire. And at the far end, it would be a democratic leadership style, whereby you're asking questions. And a quick example of those would be from Britain in terms of political leadership back in the 1980s and 90s, where the Prime Minister called Mrs. Thatcher. And she used to go into cabinet meetings, which are supposed to be collegiate leadership. And she'd go in there, she'd say, and her style was to say, I think we should do X. Does anybody disagree? And of course, not many people disagreed, given she could sack them. You would be a very brave person to disagree. She didn't say, well, what do you think? Some years later, we have a Prime Minister called Tony Blair, and he took the opposite view. He used to go into meetings on his sofa, and he used to say, what do people think about this? So you see clearly the same role, same organization, government, a completely different style, which was, to use Lewin's terms, an autocratic one. I think we should do this. What do you think? Anybody disagree? Good. versus the democratic one. Well, I'm not really sure what the best thing is. I've got my ideas, but I'd like to, share them. What do you think? So again, a very, very different style, isn't it? And so the opposite to that would be to use two factors, which is about work. And again, the famous research of those three there, how much interest in people versus jobs is given. And I won't spend a lot of time on this other than say Ohio University, same concepts, different words, consideration, employee-centered, concern for people, versus work, initiating structure, job-centered, concern for production. And Blake and Mouton are probably the most famous ones, so it's worth spending a minute on them in terms of there they are, because they produce a useful takeaway for you. Again, this is one I use a lot, which is a managerial grid. And if this was a physical talk, I would hand this out, printed copies, and give you 5 minutes to put a cross somewhere on that grid. Where do you think you are? And most people don't go down the low end, 1-1. Never see people putting 1-1 or even 1-9. Most people sort of go, because it's a spectrum, it allows you that choice, doesn't it? It doesn't say you have no concern. It's saying how much. And that's why I love this, because it forces you to think, do I want to put it higher or lower? So again, as a takeaway, think about where you would put your little cross on there. Most people, middle of the road is why it's called that. Most people sort of say, well, yeah, I'm concerned for production quite a lot, but I'm concerned for people. So does that give me, 5, 7 or something like that? So it's a great sort of takeaway from it, really. So it's short of time, so I'll just go for a summary. Then we can move on to the final part in the last 5 minutes, which is really the struggle to explain leadership in uncertain times is that, and we've just been through those. From the 1920s, it's the great man trait theory. I'll give you some humorous examples of left-handedness of leaders, but it could be any factor you wanted. By the 40s, it's about people's behavior. And, we've looked at Ohio, Michigan, and Blake Mouton. But today, it's much more about contingency theory. It's about the situation itself, about servant leadership, values-based leadership, isn't it? And that's really where I come in terms of why I think effective leaders are made. Because I think it's about serving the interests of investing in employees and developing a winning team about the same goal. How do you do that? And I spent some time working with a great guy from America called Dave Ulrich, who's a wonderful mentor to me, actually. And we wrote this book comparing leadership across Asia. And he's much more of a sort of practice-based academic than I am. And he was always pushing, what can we give as a takeaway? So he forced us to write, out of 200 pages, a very simple chart. He said effective leaders combine those three things: context, culture, and competence. And I'll explain them next. There you go. There you are as an effective leader. What are your thoughts and actions? And they're affected by three things. The context. This is like the cultural view. This is the Hofstadian view. The views that shape norms and patterns in that country. Indonesia, UK, Japan, Russia. Of course, also affected by where do you work? Is it Apple? Is it Google? Is it the army? Is it the civil service? Is it retail? Investment banking? These are radically different types of businesses. Universities. Of course, this is when people used to throw their donuts and coffee at me if I was doing this in front of some leaders, because actually it's about you. It's about your own competence. I mean, skill is the word I wanted to use. And he said, no, you can't use skill. It's an S. What we need is a C. Okay. So he came up with competence, your own style, traits, predisposition. So it's about skill, is where I really wanted to take it in the last few minutes. Because if we believe that, we don't believe it's about traits. You're not born. You can learn. With this takeaway template, I'm just going to focus on, I can't really touch the context and culture because it depends where you are, but I can touch on competence. And the way to look at competence is a famous author, Robert Katz, who wrote 1955, clearly dead. But he did the opposite, to what people were doing. I always like people who do that. He appeared at a time when everybody was still after those traits. You know, what is it that makes a great leader? He said, no, it's nothing to do with that. It's the opposite. That's skills. They're developable. And so if I'd ever written one thing that Katz had written, I'd die a happy academic, because he wrote the following. If I ask you what a skill was today, and we spent 20 minutes discussing it, almost certainly we'd spend 90% of the time doing the topic. A technical skill. How to drive, how to operate Zoom, how to operate software, how to operate a machine. But actually, it's much more about three things. And so he chopped them up. He said it's about human skills as well. How you work, understand, and motivate others in a group. And the key one is actually about concepts, mental ability to analyze and diagnose complex situations. And that's a really hard skill. So when people talk about skills to you in the future, always try to think, what are they talking about? Are they talking about technical, human, conceptual? And that's the one important thing he wrote. The second important thing he wrote in this article was he didn't just say there was those three, he said they changed over time. And they changed over time in terms of what was more important and less important. And so the way to look at that is always on a chart. The easy way to look at that is, he used the word producer. You could use the word banker there if you wished. Office worker, academic, whichever term you want. Start your job, you need an awful lot of technical skill. Are you a good banker? Yes. Are you a good academic? Do you write articles? Yes. Yeah, I have to always interact with people. We don't really need a lot of conceptual skills at that stage. However, as you progress to be a senior banker, senior lecturer, those skills start to morph, don't they? Technical skills are still important, but you can see now the others are starting to develop, and it's not going to take you long to work out the way this chart is going. By the time you're at the middle manager position or the senior executive position, you can see clearly the skill package, the mix in that package has changed. Yes, you need some technical skill to know what's going on, but we're not paying you as chief executive of Barclays Bank to be a great banker. We're paying you to be a great chief executive. No different than a university. We're not paying the vice chancellor of Oxford University to be a great academic, which she is. You know, she wrote a famous book on the Irish peace process. We're paying her because she's got great human skills and she's got great conceptual skills. Where's a world-class university going to go in the next 20 years? That's what we're paying her to do. So I think Katz, as a takeaway, is another great thing for you to think about. And the way to think about that is in terms of the conclusion, because different leadership styles are more or less appropriate for COVID or certain times, aren't they? And I sort of tried to put it on a, told you I like simple. A simple chart. So we now know uncertainty on the left, how uncertain, crisis, changing, stable. That'd be nice. And also, who are you dealing with? Inexperienced, capable, or an expert? Because, of course, the question would be, leadership style changes, isn't it? So if this was a wartime, you could think trying to put Winston Churchill on there. Where would you put him? Environment and crisis, that's for sure, that's for certain. Who's he dealing with? Inexperienced, capable, you know, in the army, an expert. So he's clearly taken a much more participative style. If it's a stable environment, of course, it's a different sort of package altogether, isn't it? So I've run over slightly by 2 minutes, so I shall wrap up with final conclusion, which is cometh the hour, cometh the man. And it brings us back to COVID, because what's happened is it put undertrained leaders, and the phrase is accidental leaders, under pressure. I think what it's done is produce three insights for us to take away. It's not about labels. It's not about positions. It's about what you do. This is from Goff and Jones again, when they were asked to write about what they thought the implications were. It empowered people to implement those principles because they didn't know what to do. It's about social distance. It's about knowing when to encourage loyalty and when to step back, keep people focused on the goal, but to give relationships an edge. And I think very tricky and most difficult one is about organizations, because they're bound by sociability and solidarity, aren't they? It might have strengthened societal solidarity. We're all in this together. But of course, it's done what we're doing today, hasn't it? It's chipped away at sociability. So we're not in a very nice college in Oxford drinking coffee together. We're using technology sort of from around the world to join ourselves virtually, but it's not the same. It's not face to face. I think that's a real sort of killer point to think about. And so the final slide I put on was I've run over by a minute because we started late, is for you to think about. Beware of those variations in styles. I'll give you some examples of effective leaders. I'll give you some examples of authoritarian, participative leaders. And of course, the one that most managers don't think about, which is the reactions to that. How do co-workers, team workers, fellow managers react to that style? And of course, recognize your own bias. And this is easy for me to say because we all do this. It's easy to do what comes naturally. But at other times, it's actually important to recognize you need to do something different. A knee-jerk reaction, what you always do, is the wrong thing to do. So I think the final takeaway for you to go away with today would be that effective leadership in uncertain times is about an appropriate style, given those reactions to it that we know about. It's those skills, emotional intelligence. Think of Shackleton, how he sort of manipulated and used skills to get those 26 crew members all home safely, because he's dealing with specific people in a particular situation. But when people say, "Oh well, do you have a sort of a menu almost of what it takes?" Well, there are some ingredients. I'll give you these ingredients, but the exact mix of those ingredients for that menu varies by people you're dealing with, the country, type of business, and the situation. How uncertain is it? So thank you for listening. And as I said, we started a bit late. So in fact, I think I've had exactly 60 minutes of talking. We started at 10:07. It's now 9:07. It's now 10:06. So thank you all for being here. And we've now got 15-20 minutes for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. And that was a very illuminating, thought-provoking talk, and really gave us some fascinating insights into what kind of leadership role we should be pursuing at this time of uncertainty and time of crisis. What I will do now is I'd like to pass the mic over to Mr. Bintoro, and we can bring in questions from the floor. So we have approximately 15 minutes for a Q&A session, and I'd kindly ask Mr. Bintoro to assist me in this process. So do we have any questions, both either in chat or alternatively if you want to ask directly?
Yes.
Sure.
Dr. Stewart and friend colleague here. So you can ask a question, goes to chat, put your name and the question on chat, but also you can have on mic, but I do not know how many people will ask. Please raise your hand so I can know how many people will ask. Pak Fasli Jalal, of course, you are the first. Pak Fasli Jalal is the Vice Minister of Education, a former minister. So I'll give a floor to you, but before I'll still have one or two people who raise the hand. Otherwise,
Yes.
I will ask also a question.
Yeah.
Okay. Pak Fasli Jalal, floor is
Thank
yours.
you, Pauno. Thank you so much, Professor Rowley, for very insightful, stimulating presentation. My question is, as a person working in university setting, we have many professionals working with us, yeah. But you mentioned about the connecting the style, the individual setting, and also your trade, or whatever you call it. how low can we go? Do we go to every faculty members, or can we combine them into clustering, for example, the study program or a school, or even at the wider mandate at the university level? How we put our time and effort to address so many needs, because the challenging at the leadership right now is so big, but we have to make sure that we can address appropriately. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Great question.
Yes, you can answer. Yes, you can ask after that. There will be more new questions.
Otherwise, I'll lose track of the questions.
Yes.
Great question. I think the first thing I would ask is, well, depends on what the topic is, how important it is, isn't it? So if it's about a relatively unimportant, with all due respect to decision-making topic, then involvement's not that important, is it? However, it's a critical one, like, does the university move from a traditional delivery system to totally online? That's a pretty important decision to make.
Right.
You would like to get everybody on board with that one. Whether it's versus a question about should we change the corporate colours of the university, not quite so important for everybody. So if it's a really macro killer topic, you would want to get everybody involved, wouldn't you? And there'd be lots of ways of doing that, all the way from a technical way, questionnaires, surveys, open forums, and it's always thing to bear in mind, of course, so you might think that it's important or not. Other people, about the reception of your follower, they may think the opposite. And I remember a famous interview once with a Dean of London Business School, as he was, a man called Sir George Bain. And he was interviewed in the newspaper, and they said, "What's the most difficult thing about running a business school, George? Is it about, types of clients and courses?" And he said, "No, it's about decision making and leadership." And so, "Could you give an example?" He said, "Yes, the worst decision I ever made was to ask the faculty what sort of artwork we needed in the building." He said, "It was a complete disaster because everybody had their own view." He said, "What I should have done is said, we have bought this artwork, it's going in the building. Do not participate on the artwork." And that stuck in my mind. He taught me at Warwick, and he taught me not with George. I think I can remember that decision. I will. Don't consult on the artwork. It's not the should we move to online delivery. That's important, yeah, and that's worth spending time on, not colours of carpet. And I remember when I was working in Cass Business School, and they did that. They asked you what colour carpet. I'm thinking, no, that is not what we should be being consulted about. I'm happy to have grey carpet, grey with spots, grey with stripes. Yeah. So what? And it was really odd why people would do that, because it's not that important. It's called delegation. But to get back to your key one, so I think it's about what is it you're trying to lead on? Okay. Is it the artwork versus is it the online delivery versus do we become a totally postgraduate university? Those are pretty big things. Yeah. Or do we shift the balance from undergraduates to postgraduates? Levels of fees, they're important. And I think, maximum participation and buy-in of that is important. No buy-in on colour of carpet, no buy-in on modern art versus traditional art. Yeah, that's not. So if you go down that line, then it's about how do you do it? The open forum wins. If you could do it, have a great big hall, it'd take hours. You could have a snowball trickle down model. It all depends, of course. A university is an interesting creature as an organisation because there'll be everybody in there from physics and maths and languages and sciences and humanities, and they all have different agendas, won't they? And you see that all the time on any board meetings. Fine, in a business school, you sort of vaguely agree on stuff. But once you bring in a physicist or a mathematician or a linguist, all hell breaks loose because they'll have a different agenda, won't they? So how do you get that to work is the one we're trying to aim at. Yeah. So a great question, and one that's sort of a real life question.
Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Professor Fasli Jalal. There is some question from chat. I will read for you, Professor
Okay.
Chris Rowley.
Put my glasses on.
Yes, this is from Sriwijaya University. Dr. Rowley, in my mind, a leader with lack of work ethics and inability to acknowledge the employee will lead to a disorganized workplace and loss of employee trust and respect. Leader with micromanagement consider no identity and integrity as essential traits. COVID-19 pandemic changed life in workplace and make atmospheric work uncertainty. My question are, can COVID-19 pandemic bring new future and handle all obstacle in workplace to avoid misaligned, unmotivated, and likely discouraged employee? And number two, how can leader organize and work at the cutting edge of inequitable and unjust system? That's from Sriwijaya University.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Response?
Yeah, that's great. That's actually two questions. So I'll take the first one, which is about post, if we ever get to a post-pandemic work future. That's an interesting one. I mean, I had an article published about 3 days ago on it, and I can send the link to Stuart to send on to you, on a company I work for, which is an HR consultancy company. And the article's called, Are We Going Back to the Future? And basically the subtitle to that was, post-pandemic work behavior and working from home. So it's exactly on that. How do you handle those obstacles in workplaces? Because I think there's a myth about working from home versus working in an organization. And you know me by now, I don't like stark contrast really in terms of choices. It's about spectrum. At one end it says, working from home is hopeless, low productivity, can't trust people, no motivation. And that's presented as a sort of rose-tinted view of working in an office, which to me was never great. There weren't wonderful places of collegiality and innovation and water cooler moments. That was never the case for lots of people. So I think they've created what's called a straw man by saying, if you come back to work, we'll get all these benefits. Well, it depends where you were before. If you were working in a call center, you don't get many benefits going back. It was better to be at home. In fact, I've dealt with people who've gone back. It's a disaster. You can't hear them in an open plan office. Because the research shows open plan offices don't work. So, you can bring those new ways of handling obstacles in the workplace. That's for sure. So the second part was, how can a leader organize and work at the cutting edge of unjust systems and inequitable systems? And that's again about participation, isn't it? And ethos, and where this question's coming from a university where it's not quite the same as if you're working in a investment bank. These are really live issues, aren't they? Inequitable, unjust systems are really come to light there. And there's a gender aspect in banking, that's for sure. But in universities, then there's less of that, I think. I mean, systems in the UK are vaguely just and equitable because they have to be. Otherwise, you'll end up with legal cases against you. And to get back to the point about Mr. Shackleton, don't forget, he did things because of his emotional intelligence, didn't he? Of the words we would use today to describe that. And if your belief system says, we need to aim for a more equitable, more just system in the university, then that's how it's going to be. And that is going to have to come from the top, isn't it? And that's normally the Vice Chancellor in a British system. So great questions. Thanks very much. Was there another one?
Yes.
This one?
Yes. More questions.
Okay.
Professor Chris Rowley, since you mentioned about the Shackleton's style of, if I'm not mistaken, if you are skeptical, you put in your own tent. And Professor Agustan, one of the question in chat, he asks about Sun Tzu. I think you are also familiar since you are also expert in Asia.
Yeah.
Keep your friend close and your enemies closer.
That's
and what is the interpretation? Is that the same as what you mentioned about the Shackleton by putting people who are skeptical in their own tent? That's one. And then number two, I still have a question. because you mentioned about the UAI, uncertainty and avoidance index, which is, I know people normally about PD and then feminims, but UAI it's bit unknown. It's less. But then since this is the era of uncertainty, UAI, if you put in your slides that actually China, it's on the right hand of the spectrum, which is quite impressive because it's in the authorities in the left side. And my question, because you didn't put Indonesia in the chart, but I know Indonesia in terms of authority, it's bit to the left, but I didn't know in terms of UAI avoidance index, because the problem of study already make that. Maybe you can also explain about the risk taking, because this is important. Professor Agustan, the guy who was asked, is working for the National Research Agency, the largest research institute in Indonesia. 20,000 people, and mostly are professor and PhD, and they want to have their research become innovation, and then at least the UAI will be a factor. And I think we need your response. Thank you.
I think that was two questions, very long questions. Thanks very much.
Yes.
The first one was about. First one, if I remember, was about. I didn't make any notes on the first one, but if I remember, was about Sun Tzu and you're keeping your enemies closer. It's exactly that, isn't it? And you see that all the time in businesses. As don't forget, government is an organisation that's managed, and that's exactly what politicians do all the time. It's exactly what prime ministers do all the time. Is you keep those people who you think are going to take over from you inside the cabinet, close to you, because you don't want them outside. And there's a far more vulgar expression that I'm not going to repeat here about what that means. Normally revolves around tents. You see that in businesses all the time, because of course you want them to take responsibility for things that go wrong. But if it goes right, then I'll take responsibility. And that's the classic sort of manager approach. So yeah, I think that's what Shackleton did. He didn't want those people, the disbelievers, spreading their discontent amongst people who were probably open to suggestion. So why don't you all come in my tent and you can just moan away, because you're not going to change me. So that's the first one, about keeping your enemies close. You see that all the time in businesses and organizations. Second one, about the uncertainty index, is Hofstede comes in for lots of criticism. No, it's fine. It's easy to throw stones at him. He's not here to respond anymore. He always used to respond, quite aggressively actually, but he doesn't anymore because he's not with us. But the criticism in itself shows you the value of it. It's made an impact, doesn't it? Everybody knows it. And I'm still, Trompenaars and have made a sort of vague attempt to do something better, but I always just keep coming back to it because of what I think's got quite a lot of validity in terms of the dimensions. He's split it up into those 6, and uncertainty avoidance is the one. You could do it on all of them. There's the chart I did. I don't know if I did have to reread this article. I suspect he's not got Indonesia in that selection there, because of course the big criticism that I do have some support for is that it's fine for countries that are relatively homogeneous. And so the big criticisms of Hofstede would be, well, what about countries like Malaysia, which are not quite so easy to say are homogeneous? Korea, ethnically homogeneous. Japan, ethnically homogeneous, historically. And I guess that would be the same with Indonesia. They'd be saying, well, that's quite a complicated cultural background there. So how do we, which bit of Indonesia do we use? Same as Malaysia. Which bit of Malaysia?
Yeah, similar like Malaysia.
Yeah, so that's why he does collect criticism for that by saying, well, you've got to just go for something and put Malaysia on there. Well, is it ethnic Malay? Is it Buniputra? Is it ethnic Chinese? Ethnic Indian? And so he sort of tries to steer clear of that debate by saying, well, I'll put you you could easily say the same argument with China. Historically, we're looking at Han Chinese. That's what it means. It does not mean Uyghurs, does it? Because, of course, there are 35 official ethnicities in China, and there's thousands of unofficial ethnicities in China. But he's gone just for Han Chinese, I'm guessing. And that will become more complicated as societies become more homogeneous. What culture are you going to use in there? So that's the problem with him going down the lines of big blocks. Maybe like South Africa. Which bit of South Africa would you use? Would it be the white Afrikaans? Probably not, but they're still there. So multi-ethnic countries are a problem for him. It'd be great if you could say all Germans are German, all Koreans are Koreans, all French are French. But historically, that's less the case, isn't it? So that's the problem with Indonesia. If it's a multi-ethnic grouping, and that mix is changing all the time, it's like Sweden and Finland. Back in the 80s and 90s, it would be relatively easy to put on this chart, but not post 2020, whereby. Well, Russia would be far more difficult because, again, Russia's got all sorts of ethnicities in there, really. So it's a very difficult one for him to do, isn't it? But it doesn't take away from the fact that at least it made us think about it. That's why I like it. It makes us think, doesn't it? And it makes you think about the issues of doing it. So great pair of questions. Thanks very much.
I think we have time just for one last question, gentlemen.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Bintoro, do we have anything on chat or?
See something
Yeah.
on chat?
Yeah, there are some questions on chat.
So I believe we can see from leadership consists of leaders and subordinates. However, in many organizations, especially in public institutions, they tend to have a complexity in their hierarchy. The question are how leaders manage and address the urgency in doing things in those complex systems, and how differently should leaders act in accordance to their positions in the hierarchy?
Okay. That's a great question. I mean, I'll try and scoot back to the end here if I can. In terms of and the end, which is there we go. I mean, I always like to sort of try and summarize arguments with this one, isn't it? You use sector organizations of complex hierarchy, which they are, and you to use Lewin's sort of framework of basic leadership styles. Authoritarian, laissez-faire, participative, just as a basic framework. You can see clearly you would have a range, wouldn't you? Who is it you're dealing with? So we'll just take it as, it's a pretty stable environment, nothing's changing much. You got the words inexperienced subordinate, capable subordinate, or an expert. Even then you would use a different leadership style, or you could use a different leadership style. In terms of participation, if you're dealing with these experts, you would think it's always a different style, isn't it? Who is it you're going to deal with? Think of the COVID crisis with governments. Is it your chief scientific advisor? Or is it somebody, for example, the chief of the army, and you're going to make them build, which they did in this country, these huge, great hospitals from nothing? Well, you basically told them to do that. An authoritarian style. I'm assuming Boris Johnson just said, you're a capable subordinate. However, we need to build these Nightingale hospitals, they were called. They were massive places, converted stadiums into hospitals. He didn't take that style with his chief scientific advisors and his chief medical officers, did he? He sort of, well, I don't really know much about viruses and stuff. So on that bottom scale, the right-hand scale, he's there, isn't he? Saying, well, I know we're in crisis, but I can't really tell the chief medical officer what to do. I don't know what it is he needs to do. So it's a more of a participative style, isn't it? And that's the way to think about it, is what is the issue? Is it a crisis one or not? Who is it I'm dealing with? Is it, the head of the army, or is it a chief scientific officer who has skills that, that's why they're there, that I don't understand, but I need to take their advice on. And I think that's, as much as people criticize Boris Johnson as a leader, I think he does do that sometimes. He does think, I can make decisions about all sorts of things because I did classics at Balliol. Well, yeah, you did do classics at Balliol, Boris. It teaches you a way to think, critical thinking. I understand that, but it doesn't make you a scientist. A bit like Donald Trump, if people remember during the COVID crisis, he seemed to imply he knew everything because his dad was a bright guy. And again, he sort of overruled Mr. Fucci, doesn't he? In terms of, no, don't do that. Don't lead like that, because he's an expert. It's about participation, isn't it? Because it made Trump look foolish. He didn't need to, but he did, because he's a good character trait in this particular example. Whereas in Britain, it was different. So I think it's a very difficult organisation to run, but you use that chart to give you at least a basic framework. Thanks very much.
Okay, I think we've more or less run out of time, but I would just like to use this opportunity to say a few words of thank you. So first and foremost to Professor Chris Rowley, thank you very much for your time and your wonderful session this morning. To Professor Oni Bintoro, thank you so much for co-hosting the session. I would like to thank Mr. Bimo as well from Euro Management. And last but not least, all the very fantastic, wonderful delegates that attended the session today. Thank you so much for your time, for your great questions, for your insights and your input. I hope this has been enjoyable. This is a seminar series. The beginning, I hope this will be the first of many that we can work on together. It's been an amazing opportunity to reach out to our friends and colleagues in Indonesia, all the way from Oxford. So I would like to draw this session to a close. Thank you, everyone. Take care. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Thank you.
In these
Thank you,
uncertain
Stuart.
times.
Thank you, Professor Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Oni.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor. Thank you all. Okay, I will end the session now.
Thank you all.
Bye, Prof. Chris.